Hello, everybody, and welcome. So Izzy and I did want to say first, thank you to Laura and the whole Deanery team for hosting. So this presentation is really about the potential of climate litigation with a focus on youth-led climate litigation and climate change education. Now you will see that we're going to have a share our presentation in the chat here, and we wanted this presentation to have a usable component you could take home with you. So we will have some interactive elements for you to use. We're going to present it at this kind of broader fit so you can see things happening around the sides. If you are watching this presentation, it is going to be, we'll let you know when we need you to actually pull this presentation back for your interaction. So we should be good to go from there. So we'll do next slide. Okay, so hello everybody. My name is Travis Fuchs. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a settler of English and German ancestry, and I was raised in the land of dish with one spoon wampum and the two-row wampum. I've been educated in marine biology and teaching, and I worked as a 6 to 12 teacher, an administrator, and a university lecturer. I do research in science and environmental teaching and learning, and I'm coming to you from treaty land in Canada, between the Lakes Treaty Number 3, which has a rich history of the Adirondack, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit. Izzy?
Tēnā koe, Travis, thank you. Kia ora koutou katoa. Hello everyone, ko Isabella Lenhanaikan tōku ingoa. He tangata tiriti aho, he Pākehā aho. Kei tino hau ki te whenua tupuna ki Ngāti Whātua o Rākei. Really lovely to be with you all here this morning from Aotearoa, New Zealand, but this evening and this afternoon in Canada and the UK. I am tangata tiriti. I'm of Irish and Scottish descent, living in the lands of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm educated in law and biomedical science, global health and geography, and I'm currently doing my DPhil at Oxford, looking at the health impacts of climate change on people that work outdoors in Aotearoa. And it's really lovely to be joined with you all this evening and alongside Travis. Really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Laura. So I know there'll be a lot of expertise in climate litigation in the room. So this is sort of a brief overview for those that may not be as familiar with climate litigation as an avenue for climate action. The definition of climate litigation largely remains unsettled, but we drew in our paper that Travis and I, alongside our colleague Nick, wrote, which forms the basis of our webinar, from the Sabin Centre, which states that climate cases are those in which climate change law, policy, or science is a material issue of fact or law. And since the 1980s, we've seen a real proliferation of climate change litigation. And since that time, of the last 40 years, there's been generally kind of three waves of litigation. The first concerned environmental and planning law. The second consisted of actions in human rights, particularly those constitutionally enshrined rights. And the third wave regarded the economic consequences of climate change and how climate risks were identified, managed, disclosed by corporations, directors, and trustees. Important to note is that the evolution of climate change litigation is live. It's constantly evolving and developing. And one of the things recently that has furthered to kind of evolve and enliven case law on climate change is the emergence of new legal possibilities related to developments in climate science and attribution and causality. Next slide, please, Laura. So the central claim in our argument is that teachers and educators ought to ensure that youth are equipped to understand the complexities of climate change, no easy task, and on the other hand, feel empowered to respond through democratic processes, including litigation. And we make this claim on 4 independent bases. The first is that young people, like other kind of vulnerable populations around the world, have a special vulnerability to climate change. And by nature of the special vulnerability, this justifies a pedagogical approach to climate change that firstly takes seriously those who will be most impacted by collective inaction, and secondly emphasizes forms of democratic participation and response, which importantly for the nature of this webinar includes legal action. The second relates to the moral imperative. Despite their special vulnerability, young people are often politically disempowered by society. We know that young people across the world are empowered. That's visible through lots of really meaningful actions that young people are taking collectively, but society often disempowers and minimizes and quashes their political power, political capital, giving rise to this moral imperative to equip young people with not only the knowledge of climate change, the science and the injustice of climate change, but also the tools for climate action. And thirdly, there's a pragmatic argument. As I mentioned earlier, young people around the world are already participating, leading, organizing climate action. Educating young people about these topics is a rational and practical step to better prepare them for the kinds of civic engagement in which they're already involved in or will be involved in into the future. And the final basis on which we make this claim is the fact that petropedagogy from the oil and gas industry is pervasive within our current education systems across the world, and that mandates a strong counter, robust climate change education that counters the misinformation and the petropedagogy, the influence of this oil and gas systems that our young people across the world are already receiving. Over to you, Travis. Thank you.
So we've just justified that climate litigation is happening in three broad waves and that it's important. And then we also think it's really educationally relevant. So to kind of try to bridge these two areas, we surveyed some climate education literature and landed on a Hargis and Mackenzie's climate change education framework that tries to highlight four central learning dimensions crucial to climate change education. And these include action-oriented, justice-focused, cognitive, and social emotional. And these learning dimensions are really meant to provide students with skills and competencies to adapt and mitigate to many of the adverse effects of climate change. We really think there's a strong case to be made here about how these learning dimensions can tie to climate litigation and support our central claim. So we'll go through these learning dimensions first. So for action-oriented, this includes empowering place-based and participatory learning outcomes. This dimension aims for climate action ideas to actually positively impact the communities they're serving, and then in turn to remain culturally and personally relevant to the students. Justice focus really looks at prioritizing links to justice-related issues that uncover who benefits and most affected by collective inaction. As Izzy already mentioned, this dimension really tries at once to kind of safeguards the rights of the most vulnerable and also share the costs and opportunities of climate change fairly. So this seeks to address some of those systemic issues like oppression, disadvantage, and inequality that may be made worse by a changing climate. The cognitive learning dimension includes teaching scientifically accurate information about climate change and quality information, because this information often has the basis for climate policy. So there's a really nice publication by Russo-Ronoff et al. 2020, and they describe these 5 key beliefs that those who support climate change policies are likely to hold. They include it's warming, we're sure, it's us, it's bad, and we can address it. And all of these beliefs are founded in that quality climate information. And then for social emotional, this dimension really aims to help you cope with your anxiety and fear about climate change, aims to support them in naming and working through these emotions. And there's also evidence that as we kind of uncover and sit with these certain emotions like hope and concern and empathy, we can actually promote climate action. And then that in turn can help people cope with their climate anxiety or fear. And all these dimensions aim for a robust response. So what we'd like to do now is survey the group a little bit. So on slide 6, I invite you to open the presentation if you haven't already and put it to fit 50 so you can see some of the margins. You're going to see bells and home emojis that I'm going to ask you to move in a second. And I'd encourage you to move them with your keypad rather than your mouse, a little bit easier. So the bells are going to denote the learning dimension that is most important to me at this moment. And the home will be one that is most familiar. So I'd like you to take a second now and use one bell and one home emoji to show which learning dimension is most important at this moment and the one that is most familiar. Okay, thanks everybody. I think this also reflects, I think, my initial coming to this space when Izzy and Nick and I all kind of got together. As a former science teacher, I felt very, very familiar with the cognitive dimension, but was really very drawn to more of the justice and action-oriented areas. And I think what we find so exciting about climate litigation is that it really has these powerful pathways to hit on all of these dimensions. So what we did in our paper is we worked through 3 cases from our context. So from Canada, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia. And what we'll do now is I'll show you one Canadian example, the recent Mather versus Ontario, and then we'll tie it together with some of these learning dimensions before we get to a little bit of a group discussion. Is that okay so far? Nice, thanks. Okay, perfect. So this case is Mather versus Ontario. Some context needed. So in 2016, the Ontario provincial government in Canada introduced legislation called the Climate Change Mitigation Act. And this established an emission reduction target of 37% below 1990s levels by 2030. The act also authorized the government to set interim targets and to increase but not decrease the stringency of the targets, having regard to the Paris Agreement's goals. And it also created a greenhouse gas emissions cap and trade system for the province. So in 2018, a new government for the province was formed, and they repealed the Mitigation Act and they called it the Cancellation Act. And this required the government to revise the greenhouse gas reduction targets. But unlike the Mitigation Act, it didn't require the targets to consider the Paris Agreement or have any scientific basis. So the Cancellation Act aimed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And this new target, the old one had the reference point of 1990, right? In comparison to the older target, this new one of 30% below 2005 translates to actually 44% below 2005. And this number is actually even further below the consensus of what's required, which is around 52% below 2005 levels. So the youth brought legal action against the government, saying that the new target violated youth and future generations' right to life and security of the person and equality under the Canadian Charter. And then in November 2020, a Canadian court recognized for the first time that climate change could violate charter rights. So this case was actually allowed to proceed to a full hearing. In September 2022, Mather became the world's first youth-led climate case to be evaluated on the substantive issues and factual evidence presented by both parties. It was dismissed in 2022 with some rulings in favor of Mather. It was appealed, and the appeal actually held just last month with more rulings in favor of Mather. So some really, really exciting stuff here. And I would love if we spent most of our time talking about this. I know there's probably some people on this call that know a lot more about this than we do. But what we find exciting is the various ways cases like this and others can be leveraged in service of climate change education using the framework we presented. So from here, Izzy and I are going to take you through how we see these cases playing into the framework. We'll exemplify it with this Mather case, and then we'll get to some discussion.
Thanks, Travis. Through the action-oriented dimension of the climate change education framework, young people are able to explore the possible litigation avenues with reference to climate change alongside other forms of democratic participation. On the flip side, whilst teaching climate change litigation serves as an opportunity to expand on these possible avenues, beyond perhaps the typical ones that are presented to young people as being kind of viable options, it also serves to address the real limits of the justice system and of climate litigation per se, which we definitely saw in the New Zealand case that we bring up in our argument, which we won't be discussing today, but it's the case of the Students for Climate Solutions and the Minister for Energy and Resources, where judges are only willing to go so far to rule on issues related to climate change because they perceive it's something that's best left for legislation and parliamentary or elected politicians in Parliament. Furthermore, the cases that we have explored provide an opportunity to explore the legal principle of intergenerational equity, which we'll pick up further when we discuss the justice dimension. And in the Canadian context, in the case of Mather, in the appeal, there was not found to be a positive legal obligation on the government of Ontario to address climate change. This was a really interesting idea that was contended by the court, which we think opens up some interesting avenues for discussion. And thank you. So climate justice promotes an expansive intersectional view of climate change and action. And it was really great to see that whilst it may not be the familiar one that we're all, more familiar with or have greater expertise in, it is one that we see as being really important. Whilst principles of climate justice appear in international agreements and government discourse, it remains really challenging to operationalise in climate change education. And this is well-versed throughout international literature in the space. Teaching justice through climate litigation, particularly via the fair shares and intergenerational equity arguments that are brought up often in climate litigation, we think can really help to address this gap. The concept of fair shares is approached by both quantitatively by calculating emissions contributions and qualitatively by evaluating actions taken to address climate change. In Mather, the principle questioned government efforts in mitigating impacts on vulnerable populations, including whether the issue of fairness can be legally adjudicated. Intergenerational equity is similarly central to these cases, offering rich opportunities to explore the layers of justice, from distributive justice, procedural justice, and epistemic justice. Just a couple of ones to highlight. In Martha, as with the other two cases that we use as case studies in the paper, they model procedural justice, the very nature that young people are engaged in climate litigation, and are overcoming systemic barriers to decision making, is an example of kind of procedural injustice or justice in action, kind of on both sides. And epistemic justice, whilst it's not something that is addressed by the courts in Martha and actually isn't addressed by any of the three cases, how the judiciary values and privileges knowledge is really crucial in the teaching of climate litigation. Children as a climate vulnerable group, alongside other, key kind of vulnerable groups in relation to climate change, often have first-hand experiential knowledge of climate change, but may express it in different ways or may lack the kind of formal language, whether in a legal sense or in a scientific sense, to communicate this in a way that's best suited within the court's own understanding of language. And we know that there are really particular legal formalities and language that are associated with litigation. And there is a strong argument presented, across the board that courts must consider epistemological pluralism to validate diverse ways of knowing and conceptualizations of climate change. Back to you, Travis, for the other two parts.
Awesome. Thanks, Izzy. So for the cognitive learning dimension, this one was really, really exciting to me. I found myself kind of like poring over court documents, seeing how people were using climate science and quality information to form arguments about what was happening. And like two areas I think stood out to me that I think are of interest in this framework. The first is that a lot of these cases are forcing courts to wrestle with and substantiate new developments in climate science that could be of interest. There's like, on one hand, this points a little bit to like nature of science understandings, how science actually works and is conceptualized in society. And on the other, it shows really interesting areas of new frontiers in science that they're using to support litigation avenues. So there's an increasing scholarship right now on attribution science, which tries to link observed trends in the probability of climate-related events to human influence. I think there was a case today that the state of Maine brought against some major oil companies using like the third wave argument of like, hey, you've done this to us kind of thing. And you've tried to obfuscate what's been happening. And this attribution science research is important because it tries to establish those causal connections between plaintiff losses and defendant actions so we can actually get a relief entitlement. So you released this amount of carbon or you burned this amount of carbon, it impacted this people, therefore this has to happen. I think that's a really interesting way to learn more about that quality information through a litigation lens. Another area here is the ability to dispel false information. In all the cases we looked at, the facts of climate science and the seriousness of climate change impacts were all beyond dispute. And it was really nice to see. Like, what was that issue? And as he touched on this already, was attribution and justiciability. So can and should the courts weigh in? So these courses turned on the degree to which judges were willing to address the specific climate adjacent topic within their socio-legal and institutional confines. And I think this is really good because this provides an authoritative and nonpartisan view of the seriousness of climate change and its impacts on youth. And this can help push back on some of the mis and disinformation that tries to downplay the connections between a changing climate, major emitters, and the harm to humans and more than human ecosystems. And we'll go to the next one. And then finally, social emotional. This one is near and dear to my heart. I most recently taught grade 6 science for a year last year. I taught a unit on climate change. This was at the forefront of a lot of our students' discussions. Really, how do we kind of deal and cope with these ideas? And in this space, I've been really drawn to the work of Carolyn Hickman out of the University of Bath. And she talks about the importance of this internal and external activism to understand our feelings of eco-anxiety and grief. So the internal bit are really those feelings, while the external is more doing something in the world. And what I find refreshing about this climate litigation in this learning dimension is that there are a wealth of perspectives you can see that lets you be exposed to them and can help you, I think, mount a healthy climate response. So as an example, in Mather specifically, there were 12 groups that were granted leave to intervene in the plaintiff's appeal, including a National Physician Association and the Canadian Indigenous Councils. And this framing of hope, I think, is necessary so youth don't feel so isolated or defeated or betrayed by these adults that are really charged with their care. And it reflects this practice of intergenerational allyship, which I think is important. But on the flip side, and this is something that I always appreciate about Hickman's work, is that like cautioning against too much of this hope and making it all sunshine and rainbows. These cases also highlight a more cynical and realistic view of the potential of these legal strategies. In Mather, there's this beautiful line in the court documents where the defendants said that an Ontario climate policy, and I'll quote, was basically meaningless. And this is a really stark view of the government's perception of the problem. And I think this dose of realism is needed so youth don't feel lied to about the severity and tractability of this issue.
Thanks, Travis. So we're now going to move to the breakout groups now that we've kind of gone through the framework. And this will give you an opportunity to discuss these different learning dimensions, both through the case study that we've presented, but also we really invite you to draw on your own knowledge, especially if you have existing knowledge of other climate litigation that you can raise with the members of your group. So Laura is going to kindly pop the different learning dimensions into a poll in the chat, and you'll be able to vote just on one that kind of best identifies with kind of where you're thinking, or if you'd like to learn more about it, or choose one of the learning dimensions you'd like to spend some time discussing, and then based on that group, or based on that way you've chosen, we're going to put you into a breakout group, and you'll have let's have a look at the time, roughly 15 minutes, I think, to be in that group to go through some points that we'll bring up in a second. Hopefully everyone can see that in the chat. Laura, do you mind just moving to the next slide? I'll just explain what people are going to be doing. Thank you. So again, just to remind you and remind those that have just joined recently, is that there's the link to the editable slides in the chat. And again, this is a time that you're going to need to be able to access them if you can. For each learning dimension group, you'll find a corresponding slide and they're in slides 14 to 17. So once you're in your breakout group, just choose one of those or the appropriate slide. And one person in each group would be great if you could share your screen in the group, just so that everyone can see the notes that someone is able to capture from your discussion. There are three kind of simple questions that we'd like you to go through. The first is, what about this learning dimension and climate litigation resonated for you? And how do you see these connections unfolding in your educative context? And lastly, what are the limitations and challenges you should be aware of? So hopefully that makes sense. Are there any questions before we head into breakout groups, or is that all okay? Cool, all makes sense. We'll spend about the next 15 minutes in those slides, in those breakout groups, sorry, on those slides. Feel free to take notes. As we said earlier, the purpose of having this slightly clunky, we know, presentation, not in the presenter mode, is so that we can go through and create this really useful resource at the end that you can take away with both our notes, but also the shared notes of the group. So please write in the slides and you'll be able to take this away. We know you're only going to be focusing on one dimension, but you'll end up with the notes of four. Cool. So I think we can move into the breakout groups when you're ready, Laura. Thank you.
Isn't it so sad when like it immediately cuts off and you're like, that was the best idea that was happening? I'm sorry, because we do only have a limited amount of time. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for engaging and putting some things out there. So what we wanted to do, just kind of to make some of this information as again, useful for us as we move forward away from this conversation, is to go through the slides and give each group about 2 minutes to just describe something that was memorable from their conversation. So I'm not one to pick orders, but if someone from one group would like to raise their hand and then just tell us which slide to go to, and then we can start that kind of 2 minute little debrief about what was memorable to you from that conversation.
I wonder if the action-oriented group should go first, seeing as we're action-oriented.
I love that.
Hopefully the slide 8 is
Oh, you went to slide 8.
Oh,
Cool. Love that. Good. Thank you.
is that the right thing to do?
It's fine. You know what? Action oriented. You did it. We're here. Let's go.
Right. So I kind of ended up being the person to report back. Gosh, and other people, please feel free to chip in. We had a lovely, first of all, we got to know each other, so that was really lovely just to see where we're all coming from around the planet, and so many connections made just doing that is so important. So you can see what we've written into the chat. That's all of us contributing. You know, the action is really important for youth to see and experience that. It helps bridge those theoretical concepts. It helps counter misinformation. Particularly for Indigenous communities. One of our colleagues has worked a lot in South Africa, and I'm also working in New Zealand, that have been excluded from climate processes. We also have colleagues from Canada in our breakout room, and those exclusions can be both in terms of curriculum and legislation. And that, you know, a focus on action helps support meaningful action. Yeah, that's a circular thing, but outside the classroom as well, because sometimes students can, you know, leave the classroom and it can all feel a bit overwhelming. And we also see some cynicism among students because they don't see us doing anything and they have no idea what to do about it themselves because it's all become individualized. And so this can be a way to help schools model climate change action as a collective endeavor, and join some of those disconnects that happen in the climate conversation. Anything else from our group? And I'm not sure if I answered the question. Kilda.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I think in some of Izzy and Nick and I's work, what we were really interested in this action dimension was like another take of climate litigation with climate change education. And that was like, can teachers legally pursue this? And it was just kind of like, there's like different ways you can kind of slice this pie. Thank you for the contribution. Would another group like to volunteer?
I can speak to the justice focus group. We had a good sort of wide-ranging, similarly geographically varied group, and I think that in some ways that those different geographic and political contexts changed a lot of what we were able to comment on here, just given the restrictions that we face in education. I think the one thing that was common across all jurisdictions is the fact that we can see this as something that's going to resonate with the kids pretty directly. I think that not necessarily that all kids have an equal amount of focus on climate change issues, but just that as a justice issue, it's something that's going to apply to all children. Whereas, you know, certain groups of children are going to, you know, and young people are going to have certain justice in, you know, aspects influencing their lives and others won't. This is something which is a little bit more universal, so maybe gives teachers an easier way in to introduce issues of justice, and using climate as a good example of that. And I think so that's something that works, whether that's frontline groups, whether that's groups that aren't directly, you know, as directly, you know, involved. So again, depending on where you are, some young people are going to see climate impacts on their lives much more harshly than others. Like I'm in Vancouver, and our students know about it a little bit more intellectually than they do practically. But there are other places in the world where they go, those young people are going to experience the impacts of climate change quite severely. I would say our biggest limitation that we found was really that what the political structure of the education systems and how that can enable or limit, and that's not anything new, and it applies in lots of other areas of education. But I'm in BC in Canada, and we don't have an exam system. We have teacher assessments. We have quite a lot of flexibility about how we do things, which kind of enables me and teachers like me to be quite creative. And then we have group members from the UK with very strict exam-based systems, much more sort of linear, perhaps, focus and a lot less time to deviate from the norm. And then we also talked a little bit about the sort of legality of it in terms of with different governments coming into place, like, are they actually going to limit the ability of teachers to engage in climate change education because of whatever the government's policy is on climate change? We almost had a conservative government here in BC that would have maybe not changed the curriculum, but certainly would have restricted teachers in some way. And we're like 3 seats short of that. So, everybody looks to the US and thinks about what's going to happen there, but I think that there are other jurisdictions that are similar. I think I shared a lot of what we said, but we also have a lot on the slide, so feel free to read that too.
Thanks, Chris. That's great. All right, Edwin, do you want it to be me or you for cognitive?
I think that it was a very large group. So, Travis, I think that you possibly have the upper hand here.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. So we talked a little bit about our context. So Edwin is a PRE, philosophy, religion, and ethics teacher. So we talked a little bit about the degree. I think we were like questioning and problematizing the degree to which the cognitive or quality information dimension is like the baseline needed to engage in every other dimension. Like, is this like those 5 kind of key beliefs I talked about before? Like, do those need to be had first to then engage in some of the other ones? We thought once you had a robust understanding of those, you can really work to address this mis and disinformation. And I think there's more and more evidence coming out of how the fossil fuel majors have really put a lot of time and money into like disinformation campaigns around that. And then does climate litigation actually like inherently rest in this quality information? That's just kind of what the judges look at to substantiate clause. This is how you get relief entitlement, at least in some of these suits, as he can correct me. So is that kind of the basis that we might need? We talked a little bit about that for the PRE specifically. The idea of epistemological pluralism is really exciting in this space, and the quality information can tie to that, including indigenous knowledge systems, religious worldviews. And then we talked a little bit about like an ontological shift, kind of away from this kind of like use mentality to more of a relationality, and how that could be explored through this dimension as well. And then we problematize that again with some limitations about like the level of cognitive or quality. And I think we were kind of equating this now to technology, like a techno solution orientation. Like, if we get more of this quality information, might we actually make more trouble for ourselves? Was that okay, Edwin?
Yes, sorry, I was looking at the presentation. I couldn't switch my microphone on. Yes,
No worries.
I think that is it. I mean, there are so many possible solutions that are coming up, and sometimes some of them some scientists are not even aware of possible side effects of some of the things that they want to try. I mean, there are things in Iceland going on, Australia, and other trials that are going on around the planet. So, how far is too far? It would be a good question as well on the cognitive side.
Thanks, Ed. All right, and SEL, slide 17.
Sure, I've been sort of tapped on the shoulder to speak to it. Hi, everyone. So it was myself and Jane, who's a geography teacher in the UK, and I am a climate change ed researcher at Lakehead University in Ontario, Canada. We talked about in terms of this challenging moment in time, both in terms of the climate crisis, but I think also politically, economically, the poly crisis or the meta crisis, and how in many ways coming to understand how systems are failing people and planet often results in those feelings of despair, anxiety, sadness, powerlessness, etc. I will just pop into the chat for those who are interested. For the Canadian context, we have benchmarked climate anxiety in Canada following Hickman et al. And use that to also expand upon their survey instrument to ask young people what are the kinds of supports they would like to see in schooling related to social emotional. And interestingly enough, that research showed that mostly young people just said, teach it, make sure it's there, rather than so more attending to the cognitive presence of it, just like make sure it's there, rather than the social and emotional dimensions. The other piece that we talked about in terms of seeing it unfolding, so obviously those emotions are present in our classrooms, but also as teacher educators, educating teachers and helping teachers understand their own climate anxiety. In other research we've done, we found that one of the barriers for teachers bringing climate into the classroom is actually their own anxiety. So I think that's a piece for teacher educators to really think about, or for those who do professional development with teachers, is how do we provide those supports for teachers? But I think we have to be very critical in terms of thinking about educational structures and systems and requesting young people to be vulnerable in a classroom. They may not want to be with their teacher. So what are the spaces? What are those supports and processes that can help attenuate the levels of climate anxiety, distress, but also maybe schools aren't the exact place to take that head on. Maybe it's through action orientation and these other components. And the social and emotional is maybe voluntary, maybe it's through support services. So I think we really need to think through that, and instead of just asking teachers to sort of lead those conversations and make young people feel really awkward. I know most teenagers I've worked with in high schools don't want to have those conversations in a class. So anyway, I will just leave it there, but I'm going to give one plug quickly because I know we're at time. I do run a webinar through a program called the Accelerating Climate Change Education in Teacher Education. So that is our contact list. If you're a person who would like to be following that, we always put up all the recordings if this is a weird time zone. Please just sign up, and there's a whole bunch of them. Thanks. Sorry.
Thanks, Ellen. Cool. So we're just about at time. So I want to thank everybody for this very, very rich and exciting conversation. If anyone wants to stay in the loop to this, Izzy and I are happy to talk more. We have email addresses that I'll put from some of our various web pages. That was very crudely done right there. We're really trying to think about this on two levels. One, how it can be leveraged more in schools. So maybe through things like mock trials. So if you're interested in classroom implementation, we'd love to talk to you. And more theoretical areas like just kind of how we can use climate litigation in general in this space. We will have a little bit of a survey at the end we'd love for you to talk about, just so we can kind of collate these Deanery ideas as we kind of move forward with these webinars. And then I would like to thank everybody for being here. Izzy, anything else?
Not at all, just to reiterate that, thanks. It was really enjoyed my breakout group discussion too, so thank you.
Great. Great. So Laura, do you have any closing things for us?
No, just to say thank you both very much, Isabella and Travis, for a really interesting and interactive discussion today. And from the Deanery, just to say to those who've participated, we would love to have a little bit of feedback from you. There's a QR code on slide 21 or a short URL, thank you, Travis, which has just appeared in the chat. I think there's a couple of questions on there from Travis and Isabella, and a couple from the Deanery, just to ask your thoughts on today. The last couple of slides in this set then give you a couple of other things that the Education Deanery here in Oxford is doing that you might be interested in, or you might know a colleague who is interested in. So just to alert you to those. And that's all from me. Is there anything else that Travis or Isabel you'd like to say before closing?
Okay, I guess I just say the last 2 slides are the mather, but for the other 2 cases we did. So just in case you're interested in those, yeah, that's all I got.
Okay. Thank you, and everybody will close the meeting now.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Keep in touch.
Thanks, everyone.